My boyfriend's mother grabbed my breast in front of her church friends while I was trying to nurse my 3-month-old daughter, and when I jerked away in shock, she had the audacity to smile at her horrified guests and say, "New mothers are so sensitive these days." The room went silent except for my baby's startled cry as breast milk soaked through my shirt, and I watched those church ladies' faces turn from polite confusion to scandalized understanding of what they'd just witnessed. My boyfriend Marcus appeared in the doorway, home early from work, and the look on his face when he saw his mother's hand still hovering near my chest made me realize this woman had finally gone too far. I'm Elena Ashford, 28 years old, and 3 months ago I gave birth to the most beautiful baby girl Marcus and I had ever seen. We'd been together for 5 years, living in our modest 2-bedroom house in suburban Portland, and despite his mother Diane's constant disapproval of me, I thought motherhood might finally earn me some respect. I was catastrophically wrong. What I didn't know as I stood there humiliated in my own living room, milk-stained and shaking, was that Diane had just handed me the evidence I'd been unconsciously collecting for years, and this time there were 4 respectable witnesses who'd seen her cross a line so egregious that even her precious church community wouldn't be able to ignore it. Diane had been visiting uninvited every day since Lily was born, letting herself in with the spare key Marcus had given her for emergencies. She'd arrive with her church friends in tow, using my home as her personal entertaining space while critiquing everything from my housekeeping to my parenting. That Thursday afternoon, I'd been nursing Lily in the bedroom with the door closed when I heard voices in the living room. The distinct sound of Diane's laugh followed by the clinking of my good china. I'd assumed they were just stopping by briefly and would leave before I emerged, but after 20 minutes of listening to them discuss their church fundraiser, I realized they'd settled in for a long visit. When Lily finally unlatched and I heard what sounded like the front door closing, I thought it was safe to come out and at least grab a glass of water from the kitchen. I was wrong. The moment I stepped into the hallway, still adjusting my nursing bra under my loose shirt, Diane appeared behind me with startling speed. "Oh, perfect timing," she announced to her friends in the living room, who I could now see were still very much present. "I can show the girls how we used to do this properly." Before I could process what was happening, her cold hands were under my shirt and on my breast, positioning and squeezing while I stood frozen in shock. "You see, you have to really compress the tissue like this," she instructed her mortified audience. "These young girls today don't understand the mechanics." The violation lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity as I watched 4 church ladies' faces transform from polite interest to absolute horror. One of them, a silver-haired woman named Patricia, actually gasped and covered her mouth. Another, younger woman with kind eyes stood up abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup. I finally found my voice and shoved Diane's hands away, stumbling backward into the wall. Lily, who I was still holding, began screaming at the sudden movement and disruption to her post-feeding calm. My shirt was soaked where Diane's aggressive demonstration had caused a letdown reflex, and I could feel milk dripping down my stomach. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I managed to say, my voice shaking with adrenaline and outrage. Diane had the audacity to look offended, turning to her friends with that condescending smile she'd perfected over the years. "New mothers are so sensitive these days," she said with a little laugh, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "In my generation, we helped each other. We didn't make everything so precious and political." That's when Marcus walked through the front door, still in his construction company uniform, home 2 hours early because his job site had flooded. The scene he walked into was like a frozen tableau, his mother standing in the hallway with her hands still raised, me pressed against the wall with our crying baby and a milk-soaked shirt, and 4 church ladies in various states of shock and discomfort in our living room. His eyes moved from me to his mother to her friends, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to dawning realization to cold fury. "What's going on?" he asked quietly, but there was steel in his voice I'd rarely heard. "Your girlfriend is being dramatic," Diane said dismissively, smoothing her blouse. "I was simply trying to help her with proper nursing technique, and she's acting like I committed a crime." "She grabbed my breast," I said, my voice stronger now that Marcus was here. "In front of all these people, without asking, without warning, she just put her hands on me." Patricia, the silver-haired church lady, found her voice. "Diane, that was completely inappropriate." That poor girl, you can't just... She trailed off, looking genuinely disturbed. The younger woman who'd stood up earlier was already gathering her purse. I think we should go, she said firmly, looking at Marcus with sympathy. We didn't know. We thought we were just coming for coffee. Marcus's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. Everyone out, he said, his voice low and controlled. Mom, you especially. Now. What happened next would set off a chain of events that would completely restructure our family dynamics. But in that moment, standing in my hallway with my baby crying and my body violated, I felt something shift inside me. I was done being polite. I was done making excuses for Diane's behavior. And I was absolutely done being treated like an incubator with no bodily autonomy in my own home. As those church ladies filed out with embarrassed apologies, avoiding eye contact, and Diane protested that Marcus was being ridiculous, I made a decision. This wasn't just going to end with her being banned from visiting. This was going to end with everyone knowing exactly what kind of person Diane really was, and I was going to make sure she faced real consequences for once in her entitled life. The moment the door closed behind Diane and her mortified church friends, Marcus turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Tell me exactly what happened, he said, and I could hear his hand shaking as he gently took Lily from my arms. I recounted every detail while he listened, his face growing darker with each word. When I finished, he handed Lily back to me, pulled out his phone, and called a locksmith. I need all the locks changed on my house today, he told them. Emergency service, I'll pay whatever it costs. While we waited for the locksmith, Marcus sat on the couch with his head in his hands, and when he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry, he said. I thought giving her a key would make her feel included, but she's been treating this place like it's hers. What Marcus didn't know was that this wasn't Diane's first boundary violation, just the first one he'd witnessed. Over the past 3 months, she'd thrown away the baby bottles I'd carefully sterilized because breast is best, reorganized my kitchen cabinets without asking, and told visitors that she was basically raising Lily since I was too exhausted to function. She'd made comments about my postpartum body, my choice to take medication for postpartum anxiety, and my decision to continue working remotely instead of being a full-time stay-at-home mother like she had been. I documented none of it, had told Marcus only the mildest versions, always minimizing because I didn't want to create conflict between him and his mother. But that instinct to keep the peace had just evaporated the moment her hands touched my body without consent. The locksmith arrived within an hour, and while he worked, my phone started buzzing. Text after text from Diane. Marcus is overreacting. I was only trying to help. You've always been so dramatic, Elena. This is what happens when young people don't respect their elders. I showed each message to Marcus, watching his resolve harden with every dismissive word. Then came the call from Diane's sister, Marcus's Aunt Linda, who I'd always liked. Diane is beside herself, Linda said when I answered on speaker. She says Marcus threw her out and changed the locks. Surely there's been some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, I said clearly. Your sister sexually assaulted me in my own home in front of witnesses. She put her hands on my breast without permission while I was holding my baby. There's no other way to describe what happened. The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Linda's voice came back, quieter. She touched you? Without asking? She grabbed my breast and squeezed it while explaining to her church friends how to properly breastfeed, I continued. And when I pushed her away, she told those women I was being too sensitive. Oh my God, Linda breathed. Elena, I'm so sorry. That's not okay. That's not. Diane has always had boundary issues, but that's completely unacceptable. After Linda hung up, promising to have words with her sister, Marcus made 2 more phone calls. One to his father, Robert, who'd divorced Diane 15 years ago, and would, Marcus said, not be surprised by any of this. The other to his younger sister, Bethany, who lived 3 states away and had minimal contact with their mother. Both conversations were brief and ended with Marcus saying the same thing. Mom is not allowed at our house anymore, and I need you to back me up on this. That night, after Lily was finally asleep and the new locks were installed, Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. "I want you to write down everything," he said. "Every inappropriate thing she's done since Lily was born. Every comment, every boundary she's crossed. Everything. Because when she tries to paint herself as the victim, which she will, I want documentation." I started typing, and once I began, I couldn't stop. The list grew to 3 pages. The time she'd given Lily water against my explicit instructions because babies get thirsty, the time she'd posted photos of Lily on Facebook despite our request for privacy, the time she'd told her church group that I was struggling with motherhood when I was actually managing postpartum anxiety with therapy and medication. I documented the constant criticism, the uninvited visits, the way she'd undermined every parenting decision I made. When I finished, Marcus read through it all, his face getting progressively grimmer. "I knew she was difficult," he said finally. "But seeing it all written out like this. Elena, I'm so sorry I didn't protect you better." What neither of us realized as we sat there compiling evidence was that Diane had already started her own campaign. By the next morning, she'd called every family member she could reach, crying about how her cruel son had thrown her out, and how his controlling girlfriend had turned him against his own mother. She'd painted herself as the victim of my manipulation, a devoted grandmother being kept from her grandchild by a vindictive daughter-in-law. She'd conveniently omitted the sexual assault, the violation, the witnesses who'd seen exactly what she'd done. But Diane had made a critical miscalculation. She'd forgotten about Patricia and the other church ladies who'd witnessed the incident. She'd assumed they'd stay quiet out of loyalty to her, out of discomfort with conflict, out of their generation's tendency to minimize women's violations of other women. She'd assumed wrong. By Friday morning, just 24 hours after the incident, I received a Facebook message from Patricia. "Dear Elena, I couldn't sleep last night thinking about what I witnessed. What Diane did was assault, and I'm ashamed I didn't say something stronger in the moment. If you need someone to confirm what happened, I will. You deserve better. Patricia Henderson." I showed the message to Marcus, and something shifted in his expression. "She's willing to go on record," he said slowly. "Mom's been telling everyone you're lying, but if Patricia will confirm what happened." He pulled out his phone and started typing. "I'm going to send a message to the family group chat. No more letting her control the narrative." The message Marcus sent was simple and devastating. For those hearing Mom's version of events, here are the facts. On Thursday afternoon, my mother sexually assaulted Elena by grabbing her breast without consent while Elena was holding our 3-month-old daughter. This happened in front of 4 witnesses from Mom's church, at least one of whom has offered to provide a statement confirming what occurred. Mom has been banned from our home indefinitely. This is not negotiable, and I will not be discussing it further. Anyone who cannot respect this boundary will also be removed from our lives. The family group chat exploded. Aunt Linda confirmed she'd spoken to me and believed my account. Cousin Jennifer said she'd always known Aunt Diane had no boundaries. Marcus's father Robert sent a private message saying he'd experienced Diane's violations of consent during their marriage and wasn't surprised, but the most unexpected support came from Bethany, Marcus's sister, who wrote, "Mom did something similar to me when I was breastfeeding Tyler. She told me my milk wasn't good enough and tried to give him formula behind my back. Then she touched me to show me how to do it right. And when I got upset, she said I was being dramatic. I never told anyone because I thought it was just me. I'm sorry, Elena. I should have warned you." The revelation that Diane had done this before, that there was a pattern of violating her own daughter's bodily autonomy, changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one incident. This was about a woman who fundamentally didn't understand or respect consent, particularly when it came to women's bodies and parenting. This was about someone who'd been enabled for so long that she genuinely believed she had the right to put her hands on another person's body without permission. By Saturday morning, exactly 48 hours after the assault, Diane's carefully constructed image was beginning to crack. 2 more church ladies from that coffee gathering had reached out, one through Facebook and one through a mutual acquaintance, both confirming they'd witnessed the incident and both expressing discomfort with what they'd seen. One of them, the younger woman who'd knocked over her coffee cup, wrote, "I have a 6-month-old at home, and if someone had done to me what I saw Diane do to you, I would have called the police. I'm so sorry I didn't speak up more forcefully in the moment. That's when I realized something important. Diane hadn't just assaulted me in private. where it would be my word against hers. She'd done it in front of multiple witnesses from her own social circle, people she'd been trying to impress, people whose respect she needed to maintain her image as a pillar of the community. She'd been so confident in her own righteousness, so certain that her role as experienced mother gave her authority over my body, that she hadn't considered how her actions would look to neutral observers. She'd handed me not just evidence, but credible, respectable witnesses who were increasingly willing to confirm what they'd seen. Marcus and I spent that weekend strategizing. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore, we were going on offense. I started documenting everything systematically: screenshots of Diane's dismissive text messages, the Facebook message from Patricia, Bethany's revelation about her own experience, the contact information for all 4 church ladies who'd been present. Marcus reached out to each witness personally, thanking them for their integrity, and asking if they'd be willing to provide written statements if necessary. 3 out of 4 agreed immediately. The 4th, an older woman named Margaret, hesitated but eventually said, "I've known Diane for 20 years, and she's always been pushy. But what I saw Thursday crossed a line. If it helps that poor girl, I'll say what I saw." By Monday morning, Diane's narrative was collapsing. The family group chat had turned decisively against her, with even her own siblings acknowledging that Diane has always had trouble with boundaries and maybe this is a wake-up call she needs. Her church friends were noticeably distant, with Patricia telling me privately that there's been talk about the incident and people are uncomfortable. Diane's attempt to paint herself as a wronged grandmother was failing because too many people had seen or heard the truth. But I wasn't satisfied with just being believed. I wanted consequences. Real consequences that would prevent Diane from ever violating someone else's boundaries the way she'd violated mine. And as I sat at my laptop Monday night, reading through all the documentation we'd compiled, I realized exactly how to make that happen. Diane's power had always come from her reputation, her image as a devoted mother and grandmother, her standing in the church community. She'd weaponized that reputation against me for 3 months, using it to undermine my parenting and make me feel inadequate. It was time to use that same reputation against her, to make sure everyone in her social circle understood exactly what kind of person she really was. The breakthrough came on Tuesday morning when I received an unexpected email from Janet Morrison, the pastor's wife at Diane's church. "Dear Elena," it read, "Patricia Henderson shared what happened at your home last week, and I felt compelled to reach out. I'm deeply disturbed by what I've heard, and I want you to know that this behavior doesn't reflect the values of our congregation. Would you be willing to meet with me to discuss this? I believe our church leadership needs to hear your account directly." I stared at the email for a full minute before showing it to Marcus. "Her church wants to talk to me," I said slowly. "They're taking this seriously." Marcus read the email twice, his expression thoughtful. "Do it," he said finally. "Mom's entire identity is wrapped up in that church. She volunteers there, she's on committees, she hosts Bible study groups. If the church leadership hears what she did from you directly, with witnesses confirming it, she loses the one place where she still has power and respect." He paused, then added quietly, "And maybe it prevents her from doing this to someone else." I met Janet Morrison at a coffee shop Wednesday afternoon, leaving Lily with Marcus for the first time since the incident. Janet was in her 50s, with warm eyes and a direct manner that immediately put me at ease. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as we sat down. "I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you is confidential unless you choose otherwise. But our church has a pastoral care committee that handles complaints about member conduct, particularly when it involves potential harm to others. Patricia Henderson is on that committee, and she filed a formal complaint about what she witnessed." My hands tightened around my coffee cup. "She filed a complaint? Against Diane?" "She did," Janet confirmed. "And she's not the only one. 2 other women who were present have also come forward, both expressing concern about Diane's behavior and stating they'd be willing to provide testimony if needed. The committee is taking this very seriously because, frankly, what Patricia described constitutes sexual assault. The fact that it happened in the context of breastfeeding advice doesn't make it any less of a violation of your bodily autonomy." For the next hour, I walked Janet through everything: the 3 months of boundary violations, the constant criticism, the way Diane had used her status as Marcus's mother to undermine my parenting. I showed her the documentation I'd compiled, including screenshots of Diane's dismissive text messages and Bethany's revelation about her own experience. Janet listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is a pattern," she said finally. "This isn't a one-time mistake in judgment. This is someone who fundamentally doesn't understand consent and has probably never faced meaningful consequences for crossing boundaries." She closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "Elena, I need to ask you something. Would you be willing to attend a pastoral care committee meeting to share your account? The committee includes Patricia, our pastor Reverend Matthews, myself, and 2 other long-standing church members. We can't force Diane to attend, but we can formally address this behavior and make it clear that she needs to seek counseling and make amends before she can continue in her volunteer positions." I thought about Diane's face when she'd smiled at her friends and called me sensitive. I thought about her text messages dismissing what she'd done. I thought about Bethany saying this had happened to her too, and Diane had faced no consequences. "Yes," I said. "I'll attend your meeting." The Pastoral Care Committee meeting was scheduled for the following Monday evening. In the days leading up to it, Diane apparently got wind of what was happening because the text messages intensified. "How dare you involve the church in family business? You're trying to destroy my reputation. Marcus will see through your manipulation eventually." Each message was a gift, more evidence of her refusal to take responsibility, more proof that she saw herself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. I forwarded them all to Janet Morrison. Marcus's father Robert called me Thursday evening, something he'd never done before. "Marcus told me what you're doing with the church committee," he said without preamble. "I want you to know I think it's brilliant. Diane's power has always come from her image, and you're dismantling that image brick by brick. But I also want to warn you, she's going to fight dirty. She's probably already spreading rumors, trying to discredit you before that meeting happens." "Let her," I said, and I meant it. I have 4 witnesses, documented text messages, and her own daughter confirming she has a history of this behavior. Every time she tries to lie about what happened, she's just making it worse for herself. Robert was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said finally, "I divorced Diane 15 years ago because she violated my boundaries so consistently that I couldn't stay married to her. She'd read my emails, go through my phone, make decisions about my life without consulting me. When I finally left, she told everyone I was having an affair, which wasn't true, but it fit her narrative better than admitting she'd driven me away with her controlling behavior. I'm glad Marcus has you. Someone strong enough to stand up to her." That conversation stuck with me because it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Diane's pattern of boundary violations wasn't new, wasn't limited to parenting issues, and had cost her relationships before. She'd just never been held accountable in a way that actually changed her behavior. Her church had always been her safe haven, the place where she was respected and admired. Taking that away wouldn't just be punishment, it would be the one consequence that might actually force her to reflect on her actions. Saturday brought an unexpected development. Bethany drove 12 hours from Ohio to Portland to attend the committee meeting with me. "I should have said something when it happened to me," she told me over dinner at our house. But I was postpartum and exhausted, and Mom convinced me I was being hormonal and overreacting. By the time I had enough distance to realize it wasn't okay, Tyler was 2 years old and it felt too late to bring up. But it's not too late now. If the church committee wants to hear from someone else she's done this to, I'm here. Marcus's eyes were wet as he hugged his sister. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for protecting Elena and Lily, even though nobody protected you." The weekend before the committee meeting, I did something I'd been planning since Janet's first email. I wrote a detailed account of the assault and everything leading up to it, formatted it as a formal statement, and had it notarized. I made copies for each committee member, for my own records, and one that I planned to send to every member of Diane's extended family who'd questioned my version of events. The statement was clinical and factual, laying out dates, times, specific quotes, and the names of witnesses who'd confirmed each incident. It was the kind of document that would be very difficult to dismiss or discredit because it wasn't emotional or accusatory. It was simply a record of what had happened. Marcus read it Monday morning before the meeting and nodded slowly. "She's going to hate this," he said. "It makes her look exactly like what she is, Someone who repeatedly violates boundaries and refuses to take responsibility. He looked at me seriously. You know she might show up at this meeting, right? Even though she wasn't invited, she might come anyway just to try to control the narrative. I hope she does, I said honestly. Because then the committee can see firsthand how she responds to being held accountable. And every witness I've talked to said they'd be willing to attend if needed. I'd confirmed with Patricia, with the young mother who'd knocked over her coffee, and with Margaret, the hesitant fourth witness. All three had agreed to come if I needed them there. That evening, as Marcus stayed home with Lily, I drove to the church for the Pastoral Care Committee meeting. Janet Morrison met me in the parking lot. I need to tell you, she said. Diane found out about this meeting. She called Reverend Matthews demanding to know what lies were being told about her, and insisting she had a right to defend herself. He told her she was welcome to attend if she could conduct herself appropriately, but that the primary purpose of this meeting was to hear from you and any other witnesses. Is she here? I asked. Not yet, Janet replied, but her car just pulled into the lot. We walked into the church together, entering a small conference room where Reverend Matthews, Patricia Henderson, and 2 other committee members were already seated. The room was simple but formal, with a long table and comfortable chairs. Patricia stood when she saw me and gave me a warm hug. Thank you for doing this, she whispered. What happened to you wasn't right, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say so publicly. Before I could respond, the door opened and Diane swept in, dressed immaculately in a navy blue dress and pearls, her hair perfectly styled. She looked every inch the respectable church lady, and her eyes when they landed on me were cold and calculating. I wasn't aware this was a public lynching, she said to the room at large. But since I'm apparently being accused of something, I suppose I should be allowed to defend myself. Reverend Matthews, a gentle-looking man in his 60s, gestured to a chair. Diane, you're welcome to sit and listen. This meeting is to understand what happened and determine if any church action is warranted. Elena has agreed to share her account, and we have witnesses present who can confirm or clarify details. Diane sat down stiffly, her jaw tight. As I began reading my prepared statement, I watched her face cycle through emotions: disbelief, anger, contempt, and finally a carefully constructed mask of wounded innocence. When I reached the part about the actual assault, describing in clinical detail how her hands had grabbed my breast without warning or consent, Patricia nodded in confirmation. That's exactly what I saw, she said quietly. I was trying to help, Diane interrupted, her voice rising. I was trying to show her the proper technique because she was struggling, and instead of being grateful, she's turned this into some kind of assault allegation. This is ridiculous. Did you ask Elena's permission before touching her? Reverend Matthews asked mildly. Diane's mouth opened and closed. I'm her mother-in-law. I don't need permission to help with childcare. That's what family does. But Elena isn't a child, Janet Morrison said firmly. She's an adult woman, and you touched her body in an intimate area without her consent. That's assault, Diane. The fact that you framed it as helping doesn't change what it was. This is absurd, Diane snapped. Are we really going to call normal family interaction assault? Are we going to let this generation's obsession with boundaries destroy basic human connection? That's when Bethany walked in. She'd been waiting in the hallway as planned, ready to provide her testimony if needed. Diane's face went white when she saw her daughter. What are you doing here? She demanded. I'm here to tell the committee that you did the same thing to me, Bethany said calmly, taking a seat at the table. When Tyler was 2 months old, you grabbed my breast while showing your sister how to properly help a breastfeeding mother. When I told you to stop, you called me dramatic and hormonal. I never reported it because you convinced me I was overreacting. But hearing what you did to Elena made me realize I wasn't wrong to be upset. You violated my boundaries too, Mom. And you never apologized. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Diane stared at her daughter, speechless for perhaps the first time in her life. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. Diane, this is clearly a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. The committee is prepared to offer you a path forward, but it requires genuine accountability and commitment to change. Path forward? Diane's voice was shrill now. You're acting like I'm some kind of criminal. I'm a devoted member of this church. I've volunteered here for 20 years, and you're going to believe these accusations over my years of service? We're believing multiple witnesses who have no reason to lie, Patricia said firmly. I saw what I saw, Diane. It was inappropriate and violating, and the fact that you can't seem to acknowledge that is deeply concerning. The Pastoral Care Committee meeting continued for another 90 minutes, and with each passing moment, Diane's composure cracked further. Reverend Matthews presented the committee's requirements: mandatory counseling focused on boundaries and consent, a formal written apology to both me and Bethany, a temporary suspension from all volunteer positions, and a commitment to respect the no-contact boundary Marcus had established. This isn't punishment, he explained carefully. This is a pathway toward genuine healing and restoration. But it requires you to acknowledge what you've done and commit to real change. Diane's response was exactly what I'd predicted. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her face flushed with rage and humiliation. I will not be treated like a criminal in my own church, she announced. I will not apologize for trying to help my family. And I certainly will not sit here and be lectured by people who know nothing about the sacrifices I've made as a mother and grandmother. She looked directly at me, and the hatred in her eyes was palpable. You've poisoned my son against me. You've dragged my daughter into your vendetta, and now you're trying to destroy my reputation in my own church. I hope you're proud of yourself, Elena. I am, I said quietly, and something in my calm response seemed to infuriate her even more. I'm proud that I'm protecting my daughter from someone who doesn't understand consent. I'm proud that I'm standing up for myself and for Bethany. And I'm proud that I'm making sure you face consequences for once in your life. Diane grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, but before she left, she turned back to the committee. You haven't heard the last of this, she said coldly. I've given 20 years to this church, and this is how you repay me? By siding with an outsider who's been in the family less than a year? She was conveniently forgetting that Marcus and I had been together for 5 years, that Lily was her biological granddaughter, that her own daughter was sitting right there confirming the allegations. But facts had never mattered much to Diane when they contradicted her preferred narrative. After she left, Reverend Matthews sighed deeply. I'm sorry you had to experience that, he said to me. Unfortunately, Diane's reaction confirms what the committee suspected. She's not capable of accountability right now. We'll be moving forward with the suspension of her volunteer positions and a formal notification to the congregation that she's on a leave of absence pending resolution of a pastoral care matter. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means she won't be allowed to lead Bible studies, serve on committees, or represent the church in any official capacity, Janet explained. It also means that when people ask why, we'll be honest. Diane violated someone's boundaries in a serious way and refused to take responsibility or seek help. We won't use your name unless you give permission, but the church leadership will know enough to protect other vulnerable members from similar behavior. Patricia leaned forward. Elena, I want you to know that I've already spoken to several other women in our congregation who've had uncomfortable experiences with Diane. Nothing as serious as what happened to you, but definitely boundary violations. Comments about their bodies, unsolicited advice delivered in humiliating ways, touching without permission. You're not the only one she's done this to. You're just the first one who had the courage to say something publicly. That information was both validating and horrifying. How many women had Diane made uncomfortable over the years? How many had stayed silent because they didn't want to cause conflict, or because Diane had convinced them they were being too sensitive? As I drove home that night, I felt a strange sense of calm. The committee meeting had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped. It had created an official record of Diane's behavior, removed her from positions of authority where she could harm others, and made it clear that her actions had consequences beyond just being banned from our house. When I got home, Marcus was waiting up with Lily asleep in her bassinet. How did it go? He asked, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. Your mother walked out when they asked her to apologize and get counseling, I said. She refused to take any responsibility and threatened the committee. So they're suspending her from all volunteer positions and notifying the congregation that there's a pastoral care issue. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. She's going to be furious. Her whole identity is wrapped up in that church. I know, I said. That's the point. She needs to understand that actions have consequences and that she can't just charm and manipulate her way out of accountability anymore. What happened over the next week exceeded even my expectations. Diane, true to form, tried to control the narrative by posting a long, martyred Facebook status about being persecuted by church leadership for trying to help her family and how modern boundaries have gone too far. But the post backfired spectacularly. Patricia Henderson commented publicly, "Diane, I was there. I saw what you did. You grabbed that poor girl's breast without permission, and calling it help doesn't make it okay. Take some responsibility." 3 other church members added their own comments, some sharing their own uncomfortable experiences with Diane's boundary violations. The post was deleted within hours, but screenshots had already circulated. Marcus's extended family, many of whom had initially been sympathetic to Diane's wronged grandmother narrative, began reaching out with apologies. Aunt Linda called to say she'd had a serious talk with her sister and was appalled by Diane's refusal to take responsibility. Cousin Jennifer sent a long message detailing her own experiences with Aunt Diane's inappropriate behavior over the years. Even Marcus's father, Robert, reached out to several family members, confirming that boundary violations had been a pattern throughout his marriage to Diane. By the end of the week, Diane's carefully constructed image had completely collapsed. She'd lost her volunteer positions at church, lost the support of most family members, and lost the respect of her social circle. The 4 church ladies who'd witnessed the assault had all been contacted by other women sharing their own uncomfortable experiences with Diane, and a pattern had emerged that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. But the most satisfying consequence came from an unexpected source. Margaret, the 4th witness who'd been initially hesitant to get involved, sent me a Facebook message on Friday evening. "I need you to know something. After that committee meeting, I told my daughter what I'd witnessed because it was weighing on me. Turns out Diane had been helping with my daughter's breastfeeding last year when my grandson was born, and my daughter was so uncomfortable with how physical Diane got that she stopped going to church events. She never said anything because she thought she was being oversensitive, but hearing what Diane did to you made her realize she wasn't wrong to be upset. We're both filing formal complaints with the church. Thank you for speaking up." I showed the message to Marcus, and I watched something shift in his expression. "How many people has she done this to?" he asked quietly. "How many women stayed silent because they thought they were the problem?" "Too many," I said. "But not anymore. By speaking up, I gave other people permission to come forward. That's why this matters, Marcus. It's not just about protecting Lily and me. It's about making sure she can't do this to anyone else." The following Monday, exactly 2 weeks after the assault, Diane showed up at our house despite the no-contact order and the changed locks. She rang the doorbell repeatedly, then began pounding on the door when we didn't answer. "I know you're in there," she shouted. "You can't keep my granddaughter from me. This is kidnapping. This is parental alienation." We called the police, and when they arrived, they found Diane still on our porch, still shouting accusations. The officers were patient but firm, explaining that she was violating a clear no-contact boundary and needed to leave immediately. When she refused, they arrested her for trespassing. Marcus and I watched from the living room window as they put her in handcuffs, and I felt nothing but grim satisfaction. She'd been given every opportunity to take responsibility, to apologize, to respect our boundaries. She'd chosen instead to escalate, to play the victim, to act as though rules didn't apply to her. Now she was facing legal consequences in addition to the social and religious ones. That evening, as we sat together after Lily was asleep, Marcus turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I need to tell you something," he said. "When we started dating 5 years ago, my mom told me you'd never be good enough for our family. She said you were too independent, too career-focused, too unwilling to defer to family hierarchy. And you know what? She was right. You are independent and strong and unwilling to let anyone push you around. And that's exactly what I love about you, and exactly what she hates, because she can't control you." "She tried," I said quietly. "For 3 months, she tried to make me feel like I was a bad mother, like I didn't know what I was doing, like I needed her to fix me. And I let her, because I wanted to keep the peace, and I didn't want to create conflict between you and your mother." "I know," Marcus said. "And I'm sorry I didn't see it happening. I'm sorry I gave her a key and access and the benefit of the doubt when you were telling me, in small ways, that she was overstepping. I won't make that mistake again. 3 months after the assault, Diane's world had contracted to almost nothing. The church had formally removed her from all volunteer positions, following 2 more complaints from women sharing similar experiences. Her social circle had evaporated when Patricia Henderson and the other witnesses made it clear they stood with me. Marcus's extended family had rallied around us after learning the full truth, leaving Diane isolated except for 1 or 2 enablers who still believed her version of events. But the most devastating consequence was one I'd engineered specifically. I'd spent those 3 months working with a family attorney to formalize grandparent visitation rights. Under Oregon law, grandparents can petition for visitation, but Marcus and I filed a preemptive motion documenting Diane's pattern of boundary violations, the assault, her arrest for trespassing, and statements from multiple witnesses, including her own daughter. The judge reviewed our evidence in a preliminary hearing, and I watched Diane's face crumble as he stated, "Based on the documented pattern of behavior that includes physical assault, violation of parental boundaries, and unwillingness to respect court-ordered no-contact provisions, I'm denying any grandparent visitation rights and issuing a formal restraining order. Mrs. Walsh, you are to have no contact with the minor child or her parents for a minimum of 2 years, at which point you may petition for review if you can demonstrate meaningful behavioral change through documented therapy and compliance." Diane tried to speak, but her attorney, clearly exasperated with his client, put a hand on her arm. "Your Honor, my client feels she's being unfairly punished for trying to help her granddaughter." "Your client," the judge said dryly, "committed assault in front of multiple witnesses, refused all offers of restorative justice through her church community, violated a no-contact order resulting in arrest, and has shown no indication of understanding why her behavior was inappropriate. This court's priority is protecting the child's welfare and the parent's right to establish boundaries." Petition denied. I'd brought Bethany to the hearing for moral support, and as we left the courthouse, she squeezed my hand. "I wish I'd done this when Tyler was a baby," she said quietly. "Mom still has visitation rights with him, and every visit is a battle over boundaries. She undermines everything I say, feeds him things I've told her not to, and then acts like I'm being unreasonable when I object." "It's not too late," I told her. "You have documentation now, my case as precedent, and witnesses. If you want to pursue modification of the visitation agreement, I'll help you." Over coffee afterward, Bethany made a decision. Within a week, she'd hired an attorney and filed for supervised visitation only, citing the pattern of behavior documented in my case. Marcus's father, Robert, who'd remained mostly silent throughout the ordeal, called to tell me he was writing a supporting affidavit for Bethany's case, detailing Diane's controlling behavior during their marriage and his concerns about her inability to respect boundaries. By month 4, Diane had lost access to both grandchildren, her church community, most of her family relationships, and her reputation. But she still had one arena where she tried to maintain control: social media. She posted regularly about grandparent alienation and parental rights, painting herself as a victim of our generation's obsession with boundaries. Each post was carefully crafted to avoid mentioning the assault directly while implying she was being persecuted for caring too much. That's when I made my final move. I'd been keeping copies of everything: screenshots of her posts, documented instances of her violating the restraining order by trying to contact us through third parties, messages she'd sent to family members asking them to pressure us into reconciliation. I compiled it all into a comprehensive document, along with statements from Patricia and the other church witnesses, Bethany's account of similar violations, and Robert's affidavit about her pattern of controlling behavior. Then I did something Diane never expected. I published it all on a blog dedicated to supporting victims of family boundary violations. I didn't use my real name or Diane's, but the story was detailed enough that anyone in her social circle would recognize it. Within days, the post had been shared thousands of times, with hundreds of comments from people sharing similar experiences with overbearing in-laws and parents who refused to respect boundaries. One comment in particular caught my attention. "This is my mother-in-law exactly. She did something similar when I was breastfeeding, and when I told my husband, he said I was being too sensitive. Reading this gave me the courage to set firm boundaries and consequences. Thank you for sharing." That's when I realized the full scope of what I'd accomplished. This wasn't just about punishing Diane or protecting Lily. This was about creating a record that would help other people recognize abusive behavior patterns and feel empowered to push back. Every share, every comment, every person who said, "This happened to me too," was proof that Diane's behavior wasn't isolated or acceptable, even if she'd convinced herself otherwise. Marcus found the blog post when someone from his extended family sent it to him, asking if it sounded familiar. He read it through twice, then looked at me with something like awe. "You turned what she did into something that helps people," he said. "You took the worst experience and used it to make sure other people don't have to stay silent the way you did at first." "She thought humiliating me in front of her friends would make me back down," I replied. "She thought I'd be too embarrassed or too worried about family harmony to push back. But she forgot that shame only works when you've done something wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. She did. So why should I be the one who stays quiet?" The blog post eventually found its way to Diane when one of her few remaining friends sent it to her, probably thinking she'd want to know people were spreading lies about her. She responded exactly as I'd expected, by threatening to sue me for defamation. Her attorney sent a cease and desist letter demanding I remove the post immediately. My attorney sent back a reply that I'd helped draft. "The post contains no identifying information about your client and presents a factual account of documented events witnessed by multiple parties. Your client's threat of legal action is noted, and we welcome the opportunity to present all evidence, including witness testimony, court records, and police reports, in a public proceeding. Please advise if your client wishes to proceed." Diane never responded. The threat of having all the evidence presented in court, where her assault, her arrest, and her pattern of behavior would become public record, was apparently too much even for her. The blog post stayed up, accumulating more shares and more stories from people who'd experienced similar violations. 6 months after the assault, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Margaret, the fourth witness who'd initially been hesitant to get involved. "Dear Elena," it read, "I wanted to tell you what's happened since you spoke up. After I filed my complaint with the church, my daughter finally told me the full extent of what Diane had done to her. It wasn't just uncomfortable touching during breastfeeding support. Diane had been systematically undermining my daughter's parenting, telling her she was doing everything wrong, making her feel inadequate. My daughter developed postpartum depression that went untreated for months because Diane had convinced her that asking for help was a sign of weakness. When my daughter finally started therapy last month, her therapist said the boundary violations she'd experienced were a form of psychological abuse. I'm writing to thank you because if you hadn't been brave enough to speak up, my daughter might never have gotten the help she needed. Your courage saved more than just yourself and Lily. It saved my daughter too." I showed the letter to Marcus, and we both cried. "I just wanted her to leave us alone," I said through tears. "I didn't realize how many other people she'd hurt." "That's the thing about people like my mother," Marcus said quietly. "They don't just hurt one person. They create ripples of damage that spread outward to everyone around them. And the only way to stop it is to hold them accountable, no matter how uncomfortable that makes everyone." The restraining order was set for review at the 2-year mark, and as that date approached, I wondered if Diane would actually attempt to petition for visitation. Would she show evidence of therapy and behavioral change? Would she finally take responsibility for what she'd done? The answer came a month before the review date, when Diane's attorney filed a motion on her behalf. The motion didn't include any evidence of therapy or accountability. Instead, it argued that 2 years was excessive punishment for a grandmother who only wanted to help, and that Lily was being deprived of an important family relationship. The motion was accompanied by character references from the 2 people who still supported Diane, both of whom had never witnessed the assault and were going entirely on her account of events. My attorney and I prepared our response carefully. We documented that Diane had violated the restraining order multiple times through third parties, that she'd continued to post on social media about being victimized without taking any responsibility, and that she'd shown no evidence of the behavioral change the judge had required. We included the blog post comments showing the broader impact of her actions, Margaret's letter about her daughter's experience, and updates from Bethany about Diane's attempts to violate supervised visitation rules. The review hearing was brief. The judge looked at Diane directly and asked, "Mrs. Walsh, have you completed any counseling focused on boundaries and consent as was recommended by both the court and your church pastoral care committee?" "I don't need counseling," Diane replied stiffly. I didn't do anything wrong. I was trying to help my granddaughter, and I've been punished for caring. The judge closed the file. Petition denied. The restraining order will remain in place for an additional 3 years, at which point Mrs. Walsh may petition again if she can demonstrate meaningful engagement with therapeutic resources and genuine accountability for the documented assaults. He looked at Diane over his glasses. Mrs. Walsh, let me be clear. You physically assaulted your daughter-in-law, violated her bodily autonomy, and then refused all opportunities for restorative justice. You were arrested for violating the no-contact order. You have shown no remorse and no willingness to change your behavior. This court will not grant you access to a vulnerable child under those circumstances. If you wish to have a relationship with your granddaughter in the future, you need to do the work of becoming someone safe for her to be around. 5 years after the assault, I sat at our kitchen table watching Lily, now 5 years old, carefully color a picture of our family. She drew herself, Marcus, me, and our new baby boy Thomas, who slept peacefully in his bassinet nearby. Who else should I add, Mama? She asked, looking up with those thoughtful eyes that reminded me so much of Marcus. Who do you want to add? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Lily's family consisted of the people who were actually present in her life. Bethany and her son Tyler, who visited every few months, Grandpa Robert, who FaceTimed weekly and came for birthdays, Aunt Linda, who sent cards and gifts, the church friends who'd become like grandparents to both our children. Grandpa Robert and Auntie Beth and Tyler, she decided, picking up a new crayon. And Mrs. Patricia from church because she makes the best cookies. Diane's name never came up because Lily had no memory of her. The restraining order had been reviewed again at the 5-year mark, and once again Diane had appeared with no evidence of therapy or accountability, still insisting she'd been wronged. The judge had extended it indefinitely, noting that the petitioner continues to show no insight into her behavior and thus remains a risk to the minor children. Marcus came home from work to find me reading through old journal entries from those early months, something I did occasionally when I needed to remember how far we'd come. You okay? He asked, kissing my forehead before picking up Thomas. More than okay, I said honestly. I was just thinking about how different things are now. Remember when your mother used to let herself in every day? When she'd criticize everything I did? When I was so desperate to avoid conflict that I just took it? And now you're the person other people come to for advice on setting boundaries, Marcus said with pride. The blog post had evolved into a more comprehensive resource, and I'd become something of an accidental advocate for people dealing with family boundary violations. I saw you're speaking at that conference next month. It's just a panel discussion, I said, though I was proud of it, about how to document and respond to family abuse, particularly the subtle kinds that people dismiss as just family being family. What I didn't tell him was that the conference had reached out after Diane's sister-in-law had shared my blog post with the organizers. Apparently, my systematic documentation of Diane's behavior and the multi-front approach to consequences had become something of a blueprint for other people dealing with similar situations. Bethany had successfully modified her custody agreement 2 years earlier, and Diane now had only supervised visitation with Tyler twice a year, supervised by a court-appointed professional. Every visit is the same, Bethany had told me during her last visit. Mom spends the whole time trying to get Tyler to tell her we're mistreating him or to ask when he can come live with her. The supervisor has to redirect her constantly. It's sad, honestly. She could be building a real relationship with him, but she's so focused on being the victim that she can't see what she's losing. The church community had thrived in Diane's absence. Patricia Henderson had become a close friend, and she'd told me privately that the Pastoral Care Committee had implemented new training for all volunteers on consent, boundaries, and appropriate touch. What happened with Diane was a wake-up call, she'd explained. We realized we'd been so focused on being welcoming and family-oriented that we'd created an environment where boundary violations could happen. We're doing better now. I'd even reconnected with the young mother who'd knocked over her coffee cup that day, whose name I'd learned was Sarah. She'd recently had a second baby and had asked if she could join our mother's group at church. I think about that day a lot, she told me during one gathering. How you stood up for yourself even though everyone was watching. It taught me that protecting yourself and your kids isn't selfish, it's necessary. The broader impact had been unexpected, but profound. My attorney had told me that the precedent from our case had been cited in 3 other grandparent rights cases in Oregon, all of them involving similar patterns of boundary violations. You created a legal framework for understanding that emotional and physical boundary violations constitute abuse, she'd explained. Judges are taking these cases more seriously now. Diane's life, from what we heard through occasional family updates, had contracted further. She'd moved to a smaller apartment after selling the house where she'd lived for decades. Her social circle consisted mainly of online groups where she commiserated with other parents and grandparents who felt victimized by their children's boundaries. She'd tried joining a new church but had apparently been asked to leave after attempting to take over the nursery volunteer program and ignoring parents' specific instructions about their children. She's exactly where she put herself, Robert had said during his last visit. She had so many opportunities to change, to take responsibility, to build actual relationships instead of trying to control everyone. She chose pride and victimhood every single time. That's on her, not on you or Marcus or Bethany. I sometimes wondered if Diane ever had moments of genuine reflection, if she ever considered that the common denominator in all her failed relationships was her own behavior. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all anymore. She'd become irrelevant to our daily lives, a cautionary tale I shared when helping others navigate similar situations, but not someone who had any power over me or my family. The most meaningful validation had come from an unexpected source. Last year, I'd received a message through the blog from a young mother in Colorado who'd read my post and recognized her own mother-in-law's behavior. "I thought I was crazy," she wrote. "I thought I was being too sensitive when she'd touch my breasts while helping me breastfeed, when she'd ignore my rules about my baby, when she'd tell everyone I was an incompetent mother. Reading your story gave me permission to say enough. I documented everything like you did, set firm boundaries, and when she violated them, I followed through with consequences. She hasn't spoken to me in 6 months, and it's been the most peaceful 6 months of my life. Thank you for showing me it was okay to protect myself and my baby." That message, and dozens like it, had made everything worth it. The discomfort of the church committee meeting, the stress of the legal proceedings, the family drama, all of it mattered because it had created a roadmap for other people who felt trapped by family obligation and guilt. Lily finished her picture and held it up proudly. "Look, Mama, I made everyone." I looked at the carefully colored figures, each one representing someone who actually showed up for us, who respected our boundaries, who loved us in healthy ways. "It's perfect, sweetheart," I said, hanging it on the refrigerator next to Thomas's hospital bracelet and family photos. "Our family is perfect exactly as it is." That night, after the kids were asleep, Marcus and I sat on our back deck watching the stars. "Do you ever regret how it all went down?" he asked. Not fighting back, but the extent of it? The blog, the legal proceedings, all of it? "Never," I said firmly. "Your mother tried to humiliate me into silence, and instead I turned her weapon against her. She thought witnesses would be embarrassed enough to stay quiet, but they became evidence. She thought her reputation would protect her, but it became her downfall. Every consequence she faced was one she earned through her own actions." "She tells people you destroyed her life," Marcus said quietly. "No," I corrected. "She destroyed her own life by refusing to take responsibility for violating people's boundaries repeatedly. I just made sure she couldn't hurt anyone else the way she hurt me and Bethany and all those other women. I'm not sorry for that. I'll never be sorry for that." Marcus pulled me closer. "Good. Because watching you stand up for yourself and protect our family, that's when I knew I wanted to marry you. Not that I needed more convincing, but seeing you refuse to be a victim, seeing you turn what she meant to be your humiliation into your strength, that's the person I want Lily and Thomas to learn from." We sat in comfortable silence for a while before Marcus spoke again. "You know what the weirdest part is? If my mom had just apologized that first day, if she'd said, 'I'm sorry, I shouldn't have touched you,' without asking, all of this could have been avoided. She could still be in our lives. She could know her grandchildren. She had so many off-ramps from this disaster, and she refused every single one. That's the thing about people like her," I said. "They'd rather lose everything than admit they were wrong. And that's a choice they make. We can't save people from the consequences of their own choices." The blog post had been updated one final time a few months ago, adding a postscript about the 5-year outcome. The person who assaulted me has had no contact with my children and will not as long as she refuses accountability. My family is thriving. The church community that witnessed the assault has implemented better boundaries training. Multiple other victims have come forward with their own stories. This is what justice looks like. Not revenge, but consequences that protect future victims and create change. The comments on that update had been overwhelming. This is the closure I needed. Thank you for showing that we don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from family. Your strength gave me the courage to leave my abusive mother-in-law's home. 5 years of peace sounds like heaven. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at myself in the mirror and thought about the Elena from 5 years ago, the one who'd prioritized keeping peace over protecting herself, who'd minimized her own boundaries because she didn't want to cause conflict. That version of me wouldn't recognize who I'd become. Confident, unapologetic about my boundaries, willing to face discomfort to protect what mattered. Diane had given me an unexpected gift that day when she grabbed my breast in front of witnesses. She'd shown me exactly how far she was willing to go to maintain control, and in doing so, she'd given me all the evidence I needed to remove her from our lives permanently. She'd thought the presence of her church friends would protect her, would make me too embarrassed to react. Instead, they became the witnesses that made my case irrefutable. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be a victim, even when that makes you look unforgiving or harsh to people who prioritize family harmony over family safety. I'd learned that consequences aren't cruel, they're necessary. And I'd learned that the people worth having in your life are the ones who respect your boundaries without you having to fight for that respect. Lily and Thomas would grow up in a home where their bodily autonomy was sacred, where no was a complete sentence, where they learned that real love respects boundaries instead of violating them. They'd never know the version of their grandmother who thought family obligation meant she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. And that wasn't my failure. It was Diane's. As I turned off the light, my last thought was one of profound gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for who I'd become because of it. Diane had tried to break me, to humiliate me into submission. Instead, she'd forged me into someone stronger than I'd ever imagined I could be. And in the process, she'd lost absolutely everything she'd tried to protect. That felt like justice,